Hey guys, this is chess coach Andrew Rankin. Today I want to share a game I played recently online against a national master. His Lichess rating was 2397, and we played a Caro Kann Fantasy variation, also called the Maroxy variation, but everyone calls it the Fantasy variation. I picked this game for two reasons. One, it's always awesome to play titled players, and even better when you take them down. But two, most importantly, because I noticed several of my students going very wrong in this opening, and I wanted to cover the opening ideas because they are not easy to understand if you've never studied them before. They're very counterintuitive. So without further ado, the game begins with e4, c6, d4, d5, and now the fantasy variation with the move pawn to f3. And the idea is that if we take in the center, white is saying, no problem, I get an open f-file for a rook in the future, and my center stays solid. So white is just playing for center control. And here it's very important that we play these moves. So this is very theoretical, and it's important that we know what to do. So we play d takes e4, which looks like it plays right into white's hands after f takes e4, but now we break with the move e5. And you wouldn't really come up with this move on your own. I know I wouldn't, unless I knew that it was theory. So white really can't take the pawn. Let's see why. If he plays, if we play queen takes queen, I think this is perfectly fine for white. I mean, we'll pick up this pawn, but white's not really in trouble. The reason why white can't take the pawn is because we have this move queen to h4, check. And the top engine move is just king to d2, and clearly that's terrible. And a move like g3 just loses on the spot because we take with check and we fork the rook and the king. So that's why after the move e5, white's going to play knight to f3. And now we play bishop to g4, pinning the knight, so this pawn is still not able to be taken. And it's important to see what happens if he takes with the e-pawn. Then we can simply play knight to d7. We'll take back with the knight, put more pressure on the f3 knight, which is pinned, and our rook protects our queen, so we're not worried about trading queens because we don't have to take back with the king. So yeah, if he takes on e5, we just play knight to d7, and that's why your opponents are not going to do that. They're looking to hold on to their center, and so we're not going to take until later because we really need to make sure that we get developed. Clearly, white is going to have some tricks up their sleeve, and the first trick is bishop to c4. If you play a normal move here, like knight to f6, you're going to walk into a cold shower after bishop takes f7, king takes f7, and then knight takes e5, and he's going to win back the piece as well as two pawns. This is already losing for black, so that's why after the move bishop to c4, we have to play the move knight to d7. And the idea is that this no longer works because we take with the king. If he plays knight to g5 check, we have queen takes. If he plays knight to e5 check, we have knight takes guarding the bishop. So that's why you have to play knight to d7 after bishop to c4. Now my opponent just castled, and now we can play knight to f6, and I like this because the rook is no longer teaming up with the bishop, and our center is still nice and solid. If he plays a move like pawn takes, you got to be careful because if you play knight takes, he will trade queens, and then your knight's hanging. So if he plays pawn takes e5 here, you need to first take the knight and then take the pawn. But most of your players are going to play very principally, and they're going to play the move c3. And this is really the key move because they need to guard the center. And we need to see here why it's so important that white play the move c3. If white does something else, like a really poor move like knight to c3 or knight to e2, let's just put knight to c3 on the board. I've seen many players play this, but they lose very quickly because we have this really nice tactic with pawn takes d4. He can't take with the knight, so he takes with the queen, and now bishop to c5, and that wins the queen. Your opponent will most likely resign here. So that's why my opponent played c3. And now, just like white is hoping to hold on to their center and develop it, or sorry, hold on to their center and develop pieces that really make sure they can capture back and maintain center control, we're going to do the same by developing our bishop. And we're going to put it on d6. We're not ever worried about takes opening up the d file because we can always take back with the bishop. We could also take back with the knight, which puts more pressure on f3 and forks his light square bishop. So even though he's not defended, there's no way for white to attack the piece, and the piece is really best placed on d6. I know a few games that I've played are early on in the fantasy variation where I went bishop to e7. There are some bishop sacrifices, and your bishop actually ends up quite misplaced here. So that's why d6 is excellent. Now my opponent played queen to b3, and I thought for a while here, and I realized that he's not developing. His king is open, and the center might just collapse if he's not careful. So I'm just going to play principal chess and say, you want my pawn? You can take it. And this is actually already -1 for black. And that's really interesting because if he's going to win a pawn and the position evaluation is -1, then black is technically ahead 2 points. Let's see what happens after a move like queen takes b7. We actually do play rook to b8. If he takes here, then we just have knight takes on e4. So that's why he's going to play queen takes c6, guarding e4. But now we just continue with a rook to b6, queen to a4. And then we can play bishop takes f3, rook takes f3. And now you could take on e4 if you want, or you can play pawn takes d4, pawn takes d4, rook to b4. The queen moves back. And then we can simply attack this pawn. And white's center is going to fall apart. White's pieces are undeveloped. And he's just simply not ready for the attack. So a move like queen to b6 in this position is still -1. And black is doing quite well. We're going to pick up the pawn with moves like bishop to e5. And once this pawn falls, I think this pawn will be very weak. The knight also guards this square. So we can even like play forks like this right now that this pawn is gone. So tactically, I think white is just kind of busted here. So that's why my opponent chose not to take the free pawn. I sort of said, you know, come on, baby, take it. And he realized, I don't know. I like my battery more than I like taking a free pawn. So he just developed his bishop to g5, pinning my knight. And now, since he didn't take my pawn and this battery looks pretty strong, I just played pawn to b5. The computer says this is the best move, so I'm happy about that. He took on f6, and I made a blunder here. I decided to go into this variation where I took his bishop, he took my queen, I took his queen, he moved away, and I took the pawn on a2, which seemed very simple. I felt like him being underdeveloped and his center being under attack that I would get plenty of counterplay. Eventually my rook is going to make it to the b file, and the bishop can come back to e6 and kick the rook off, protecting the pawn. So I felt like I had plenty of targets, but it turns out that the computer really likes after bishop takes, just knight takes. It says it's -2.4, and the reason is because the bishop will go back to e2. We play e takes d5 again, and then we actually take the knight, and then we pin the pawn, and we have the exact same threat, and this pawn is, you can't defend it. Because even if he plays moves like, let's say, queen here, we can play bishop here, rook here, rook here. I mean, all of our pieces are piling up on this. This is a bad bishop. This is a great bishop, great knight. Black is doing great here. So I did miss that. It's really good to know. So instead, I just went into this variation, and we ended up in this position. Now the computer likes me to put the rook here and prepare the move, bishop to e6, but I simply played bishop to e6 first, questioning where the rook is going to go. And it turns out that it was a good idea because he blundered right away. He thought for a good 10 seconds and then played rook to a3, missing the fact that, yeah, just bishop takes rook. He asked for a take back, but because he thought for a while and I said good luck, have fun, and he didn't say anything, I figured I don't think you really deserve a take back. It's clearly not a mouse slip. So he took back with the knight. I just closed the pawn chain here with f6. I don't actually mind losing this pawn because he's going to have to give up a bunch of minor pieces as well as the rooks will trade off. And I don't think that two minor pieces against a rook and a knight or a rook and a bishop is going to be able to use anything with these pawns. I guess it would be the E pawn and the C and the B pawn. So these pawns would all fall in the center, and I have the opportunity to create a passed A pawn. So I don't honestly think losing the E pawn is the end of the world. He agreed, so after I rook A to B8, he just played B4. But now I just decided to start cracking at his structure, so A5, pawn takes, and then rook back to A8. He pushes the pawn to C4. I guess he wants to push here, but I don't really care. I'm just going to take, and now I'm on his knight. He plays bishop to E1. I guess he thought that after rook takes bishop here that he was gaining something. I guess he thought he was going to win back the exchange, but now instead of being down the exchange, he's down a whole piece. I just move my rook back to A8. He takes, and I take with the king to get moved closer to the center. He pushes the pawn, which makes sense. I take, and now he takes so that he has a stronger foundation than if he took with the E pawn here. I think this is just a target. So that's why he decided to take with the C pawn. And I just moved the bishop back. I have ideas of going here to attack the knight or going here to attack the pawn base. Excuse me. He goes rook to C1, which makes sense. He wants to harass me on the 7th rank, but I just played king to E7, and the rook here, I don't really know what it's doing. He moved the knight, and now I decided to just break at the pawn structure because I don't want to give him any counterplay. So he takes, and now I take with the bishop, and he puts the rook here. And I decide to give him a check and then pin the knight. That way the king is actually overloaded. It can't defend the pawn as well as the bishop. So when he goes here, I can just play bishop takes pawn. He moves his rook here to get back, but so if he goes rook here, I take the pawn with my bishop, defending the pawn. And if he goes rook here, then I would play king over. And if he attacks the knight, then I can play bishop takes pawn, defending the knight. So I don't think his rook actually has any real play on the back rank. And that's why he just decided to push the pawn because it was going to die anyway. But now I think my structure is simply improving. He puts the knight here and I attack it. He moves here to attack my bishop. And now I just solidify my position. He pushes. I push f5, threatening f4 if he was to threaten my bishop. f4, check. The king would have to go here, only move, and then I can check and win the knight with the rook, and therefore when he takes here, I can take with the pawn, and I don't end up damaging my pawn structure. He doesn't end up winning my pawn, and he loses this pawn for my bishop. So at the end of this, he loses more material, so that wouldn't be good for him. He decides to move the king. But now I can put more pawns on dark squares to aid the light square bishop and attack the knight so there's no pawn to h5. But for some reason he decides to push the pawn anyway. I think he's getting desperate here. We just play rook to a3 so that we can pick up the knight with the rook and not damage our pawns or lose the f pawn. He moves the king here, which is kind of just, you know, fuel for the fire. I mean, he's just going from small mistake to big mistake because now I can take the knight with check and then I can take the pawn and I don't even lose a piece, or we don't even exchange pieces. He just loses a pawn and a piece here. He moves rook to h8 attacking the pawn and I just move back. So the end of this game comes pretty quickly. King f6, the rook gives a check, the king improves. The rook attacks my knight, so I centralize the bishop, defending both the pawn and the knight. Sorry, those are some crappy arrows. He moves the rook back. I push h5. Then I bring the knight here because I want to stop him from checking me on g8. He brings the king there. I push h4. I push h5, h3, which is guarded by the bishop, and he resigns here because he realizes that like check here and then promoting is the threat. I'm also threatening mate here, so he has to play a move like this. Yeah, I mean, this position is just lost for black, or for white, I mean. But let's go back to the opening and go over this just one more time. So e4, c6, d4, d5, f3. You take, and then you break with e5. This is called the point defense, because we just simply poke a pin right in white's position, and it turns out that white can't actually take the pawn. So knight f3, bishop g4, bishop c4, and you have to play knight to d7. You have to be able to take back to guard the bishop after the sacrifice. And that's why castles. Now knight f6, c3, which is very important, otherwise we're threatening pawn takes, queen takes, bishop c5, a nice counter trap for black. And now we need to put the bishop on d6, very important. And he plays queen to b3, and we castle. So this is really the setup that you want. The bishop goes here first, then the knight to d7, then the knight to f6, then the bishop to d6, and then you castle. Just remember these, and remember to take in the center and then play e5. So this is how you play against the fantasy variation, and this is how you crush the souls of national masters. All right, guys, hope you enjoyed that, and I'll catch you next time. Thanks. Bye.